Good stuff. So let's make a start. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining in this session today. We're looking at covering Learning Outcome 2, which is for the unit we started yesterday with resource management. Now, in terms of what we discussed yesterday, just a bit of a quick recap, in terms of why is this unit important and why do we need to study and understand what is resource management. I think in most businesses, and when you look at most organizations, most places, resources are always finite. So when we look at resources, financial, administrative, equipment, plant, machinery, manpower in particular, all these resources are always finite. So at some stage, when you do get into management and you have supervisory responsibility, one of the things that you would appreciate and need to have an understanding of would be the fact that how do you manage them? When I say manage, I mean manage resources. And these resources typically are always finite within organizations because at some stage they are always related to, finance or money. And when we look at finance and money, at some stage, management and people within management also look at productivity, also look at, the aspect of efficiency. And in those cases, what generally tends to happen is that when you look at these as and relate them to some sort of time, cost, and quality, you would see that most management or most people in management would essentially then start to look at managing them quite effectively. And they would then take steps to be able to manage these resources. When I say these, I mean financial, administrative, infrastructure, equipment, human resources, manpower in particular. And the idea would be to try and get optimum efficiency and productivity from them. Now, with that understanding, we went into understanding a bit of an overview of the unit, which is to look at what is economy and what are the various sectors in economy. And, we are able to then relate which business and which particular, sector of the economy, the business or the organization operates in. And then we looked at why do we need to classify resources. So when we look at classification of resources, we look at classification of resources because that is the benchmark that we use to basically create the 3 or 4 sectors in economy that we normally see or companies and organizations involved. So when we look at the NHS, it's going to be tertiary sector because it's providing services. When I look at a company like Microsoft that we picked out, they will also be in tertiary sector. But when I look at Microsoft from a point of view of manufacturing Xbox, because it's a hardware, it's tangible, that would become secondary sector because they would be using components which are prepared by companies like NVIDIA, companies which produce processors, hardware, memory, hard drive, which are in the primary sector. They will be using those components as input, creating their product as output, and then selling it in the market through tertiary, oblique, quaternary channels. So that is where our first learning outcome, stopped. And what we are going to do is continue our journey today to look at learning outcome 2. Now, learning outcome 2 focuses on understanding what is the importance of effective use of physical resources. So after a brief overview of the unit, and understanding what are resources and why they are important in terms of management, we'll go into specific areas now. So one of the specific areas that we want to understand is study physical resources. And then the other in learning outcome 3 would be basically human resources. And then towards the end, what we are going to be looking at is primarily understanding how do we maximize the efficiency, productivity, performance, and how do we monitor, evaluate, and manage this for human resources, because essentially we are not looking at studying this unit from a point of view of social sciences. We are looking at studying this unit from a point of view of healthcare or business, and that is where the idea is that once we understand resources, we understand physical resources, and then how do humans contribute and understand and have the ability to manage these resources, then how do humans effective, how do we look at as a system managing and maximizing the use of these resources by people, staff, employees within organizations. So as you can see, it will filter down nicely into what we want to cover in the unit. Now, with the second learning outcome, we are looking at covering basically this part of the indicative content today, which is going to be with the use of some presentation and maybe a video or so, which I would want to show you. And this would be looking at how do we manage and monitor physical resources? What is the impact of wastage? Or, when you look at a manufacturing process, we have 3 parts to it broadly: input, processing, and then output. So what is the waste which normally comes out when we look at this as a process, and what in terms of the let's say the waste which comes out, how it can affect or how does it affect on, say, for example, the balance sheet of an organization, or for example, how do you look at it affecting the profits? How do you look at it affecting the quality if the manufacturer is compromised? So some part of it, we will be looking at how is the impact of resources in terms of management of it leading to wastage can be managed within the organization. And finally, we look at some of the resources which are typically technological nowadays. So when we use systems, information systems, decision systems, or decision management systems, information storage systems, we are using technology. So here the idea would be to try and understand if there are failures which happen because of software, because of hardware, then how does it affect the operations and workings of an organization or people within the organization. And last but not the least, we'll be looking at obviously creating a business case in terms of why sustainability is becoming important, why when we look at talking about corporate social responsibility, just very briefly in this learning outcome, is becoming important. And when we look at business and businesses and services and services organizations trading and providing services, what are the ethics and morality that they need to follow to be able to make sure that the services are producing sustainable or using sustainable means to be able to offer these services to consumers, whether it's the NHS, whether it's a private sector organization or a public sector organization. We'll be looking at this into by covering with an example of a business case. So learning outcome 2, we've got 4 assessment criteria, and we'll be looking at each of them after developing a bit of understanding on what the learning outcome focuses on. So let me just quickly, shift you over to the presentation, and we'll use this to carry forward our discussion. Now, when we look at, let's say, learning outcome 2, I want to look at focusing on some key terminology. So, for example, what do you mean by physical resources? So when we talk about physical resources, in terms of, talking about generally, I gave some sort of an example yesterday that what is physical resources. So anybody in terms of any ideas in terms of what are physical resources? Just to put this into perspective, when we discuss today, what are physical resources?
Goods, materials which are used in production.
Absolutely correct. So example of physical resources would be plant, equipment, machinery, buildings, infrastructure, raw material. If we look at organizations, cars, any sort of equipment like computers, PCs, they will all constitute what is called the physical resources. Now, why are they important? They are important because in order for us to get work done, we are using just to give you a point in case, an example here, we are doing a session today and I'm using some physical resources. Although we are not face to face, you are in different locations, across the world. We are using technology as a resource. And when I look at using and quantifying the word technology, I'm using a Mac, I'm using a monitor, there's a microphone and a camera. You guys are looking at using PCs or laptops or Macs, and then obviously you are receiving this through the internet, and we are using a software like Zoom. So if this was not available, for example, you have a PC, a laptop, but Zoom is not available, there would be no way that we could conduct this session. So when we talk about resources, anything physical that is tangible, that means you can touch them, you can feel them. Now, Zoom software, I can't touch and feel, but I'm using the mouse and the keyboard and the monitor and the Mac. This is a physical resource. So anything that is tangible, anything that you can touch, anything that is something that that can be used to carry out various tasks and operations would be quantified or termed as what is called a physical resource. Now, I'll give you an example. If I talk about the NHS, now, obviously, if you've, say, for example, if you're not well and you need to receive some treatment, you go into the hospital, you get admitted, but where do you stay? You stay in a ward. That's a building. Within a building, there's a room. But you don't stay in the ward on the floor. You have a bed. You have, some of the physical resources which are required. Say, for example, table, chair, bed, a trolley. Some of the medical equipment like an oxygenator. You might have a blood pressure machine. So these are all instruments which are required to be able to provide that service to the patient before even the patient goes into some sort of a surgery. If I look at an organization here, when you work within an office, you would have a desk, a chair, a PC or a laptop. You'll have a telephone, and obviously the other infrastructure in the office. If it's hot, like in the UK for the last couple of days, which is good, you have air conditioning and you have lighting. All these would be constituting what are called physical resources. Now, if there was no light, obviously your PC won't work. You won't be able to work at all within the office. You might be able to use the phone, but when you use the phone to call customers, or when a nurse or a healthcare worker uses the phone to scan a tag on your wrist to see whether it's the same patient to which the medication has to be administered, these are all examples of resources that we have to use to be able to do our responsibilities, or, obviously do the job that we want to do. Now, let's look at a video of, say, a physical resource. Now, when we talk about physical resources, if I can just, okay, give me 1 second. So to put this into practice, and then discuss what are we, talking about. So what are physical resources in business? Let's look at a short video. So give me 1 second. Let me shift you over to a browser. So what I want to do is now show you a quick video. Okay. Let's have a listen into this particular video.
Every business needs resources, whether it's people, money, suppliers, or time. The physical resources include tangible items that are necessary and available for a business to function. These are items that take space, have a value, and are used in the operation of the company. Physical resources are necessary for all types of business. Product-based businesses use physical resources for providing the goods for sale and for the operation of the business. Service-based businesses use physical resources to facilitate the delivery of the service, such as having the space to work, tools that are needed for the service, and resources used to support the service. Let's imagine you own a dry cleaning business. The company offers in-house same-day service. As a result, you must have washers, dryers, steamers, irons, tables, and racks to hold the clothes. These items represent the physical resources of your business. Materials that are resources are raw goods that will be used in the production of other products. For a kitchen supply factory, an example of a material is metal, something to shape and mold into forks, knives, and spoons. The cutlery is then a product that is sold in retail stores. The materials are not used for the operation of the business, but are a good that will be transformed and sold as a new product. For our example of the dry cleaning business, you do not sell products, only your dry cleaning services. Therefore, you have few, if any, materials. The physical building you work in is a part of the physical resources of a company. Whether the space is owned or rented, it is used for the purpose of operating your business. By having this space available, you are able to complete your work. There are some occasions when the building and facilities are the revenue generators of the business. For instance, if you own a conference center and rent space for events and meetings, the building and facility is a physical resource that also earns income. Your dry cleaning company includes a parking lot and a building where the equipment is housed for the purpose of cleaning clothes. The building is a resource where the business is operated. Machinery can be an extremely costly expense for most companies. Depending on the type of business, machinery can be a sizable resource. A manufacturing or production company will require substantial types of machinery. Have you ever seen the inside of a bread factory or the like? Huge machines, interlinked and taking up an enormous amount of space. On the other hand, an online business that offers education and information does not need much equipment beyond computer hardware and basic office machines like photocopiers, phones, etc. Your dry cleaning business requires an ample amount of machinery, including washers, dryers, and steamers. Without machinery, your business will be virtually impossible to operate. Most businesses also require supplies for various aspects of their production. Even if a company provides a service, there are likely some form of supply materials that are needed. For instance, if you own a full-service car wash, your services require soap, clothes, and towels. These materials are needed for the fulfillment of the service, but are not sold as a standalone product. Returning to the dry cleaning business, you have many supplies available for your work. Not only do you have laundry detergent and starch, you also have hangers and bags throughout the clothing. These materials are some of the physical resources you have available for your work. Energy is also used as a resource for both fueling operations or could be a product that is delivered, such as propane or electricity. It is a necessary resource to conduct all aspects of business. You couldn't run your dry cleaning business without electricity to run the machines, light the building, and power your phones, cash registers, and computers.
So as you can see, basically this video helps, beautifully clarify what do we mean, by physical resources. And I think it took a lot of examples of different types of businesses within services, manufacturing, various types, which we normally come across on a day-to-day basis, things like a dry cleaning service, a car wash, an office, or when you go to the high street, essentially, you're able to see, high street retailer, or, for example, a real estate agent using physical infrastructure, the example of a conference facility, wherein obviously the conference rooms and the centers are used to sell them as a service as against, they're an asset for some one organization, but as a asset, they basically serve the function of, selling it as a service to businesses who rent that space to be able to have conferences or meetings. Now, we see this happening in the UK quite a lot, wherein you see NHS centers. During COVID, we saw, the NHS obviously hiring spaces where COVID vaccinations could take place, like schools, pharmacies, community centers, clubs, wherein obviously sports clubs essentially, and they were all rented out locations or leased locations for a few weeks to be able to complete the process of vaccination rollout in the UK. And we do see that sometimes even the NHS and, places wherein they make those makeshift hospitals, which happened during COVID, we saw that some of the big venues across the UK, like in London, Birmingham, and Manchester, got converted into temporary facilities to increase bed capacity during the COVID timeframe. And this was then obviously once the pandemic was brought under control, obviously some of these facilities went back and they were dismantled and then went back to doing their usual, things, which was like huge conference facilities. So as you can see, physical resources, what they do in a nutshell, they help you perform tasks and operations in any field, any business, or any such, area wherein you would find, people requiring services or, buying and selling of products, goods and services. And in general, when you look at physical resources, what we are looking at is the organizations are looking at effectively managing these resources because they're looking at reducing costs, they're looking at improving efficiency, and they're looking at obviously these resources helping businesses, organizations to complete, or obviously, if I say the word, achieve the objectives rather than complete, achieve the objectives. And this is also important is because when we look at maintaining these resources or repairing or replacing these resources, it is important for us to understand that these have to be maintained in the sense, when I say maintained, if you have a new hospital or if you have a new office building, obviously you would not need to do any repairs, but over a point in time, what will happen is there'll be wear and tear, there'll be, issues which the businesses and the organizations would need to look at. And they would be looking at managing and maintaining and repairing the facilities in order to keep it functional. Now, this is more than seen in, many hospitals that obviously a lot of hospitals that we see in the UK were built maybe 30, 40 years back. So when you look at hospitals in general, they undergo routine maintenance. And obviously some of these facilities require yearly maintenance. For example, electrical circuits, air conditioning, some of the equipment require regular repairs. And obviously looking at to sign them off that they are working and functional. And if this is not done as a process to maintain the running efficiency of the equipment or the infrastructure, then it can deteriorate. And over a point in time, that would mean those investments would need to be done again. When I say those, that means investments into equipment, facility, machinery will have to be done again. And that is where the whole continuity of maintaining some of these resources becomes important. And that is why, and as I said earlier, resources are always finite. So when I look at finite risk, when I use the word finite, what I mean is that you can't just create hospitals again and again or build them again and again. You can't look at building the office space again. It can technically be done, but obviously there is time, cost, effort, and money being spent to redevelop something which could have been preserved, maintained for years and years for it to be able to perform and provide functions. Is that clear? Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Any questions? Okay, good stuff. So basically, you can also ask me if there are any doubts, any queries, and if you need examples, just mention it through the chat route as well, and I'll be more than happy to give you examples. Now, looking at some of the assessment criteria in Learning Outcome 2, first one talks about evaluating how we use physical resources and how do we monitor and manage them. Now, in this particular task, what we are looking at essentially is talking about, why is there a case for an organization or a business to look at managing and maintaining the optimal efficiency of a particular resource. So when I look at an example of, managing and monitoring physical resources, it is important that, giving you an example here, if I look at some of the, machinery and equipment which is used in hospitals, for example, now, if they are not maintained, if they are not managed in the sense they are not regularly serviced, they are not maintained in terms of ensuring that if there are moving parts in it, or if there are, bits and pieces which basically require replenishment from time to time, if that is not done, then obviously the output that is being produced would deteriorate. And specifically, so when we look at the, hospital in general, there is no margin for error, in the sense that, you can't have a machine produce results or to have a blood pressure monitor wherein the batteries are weak and it measures the blood pressure of a patient and later on you find out it became fatal. There is no margin of error, possible in situations like this. So similarly, when we look at other businesses, for example, when we look at a bank, just as an example, and we look at this from a point of view of looking at working and maintaining and running operations of a bank. Obviously, it's based in a building, but when we look at the running operations of it, there are people which work within it. Obviously, there is a safe, there are places where money is stored, and there are a number of staff which will have access rights to get in and out of the bank while still continuing to provide services to customers when they come into the bank. So here, what we are looking at is, if you have to maintain the reputation of the brand and also maintain the let's say the workability of the building, at some stage you will see that people who are responsible in administration would maintain that the building remains hygienic, the place or the environment where staff comes in or customers come in is clean, and obviously it is something which is able to provide this service for which the customers are being charged when they are coming into the bank to receive a particular service. You might be going in to basically make a transfer, to another account or a friend. You might be going in to do a fixed deposit. You might be going in to do an ISA, opening of an account. You might be looking at an international transfer. There could be hundreds of different transactions. You might be going on a holiday and you want to, convert some pounds into euros. There could be hundreds of things that you do, but you might not want to go into a bank or a branch, essentially, which is not accessible. It is not clean. It is obviously not hygienic in the sense that it does not have basic facilities like, waiting area or toilets or things like that. And those are the bits that you would need to consider when I say if you are working in a bank and you are managing the particular branch as a bank manager. So you would need to look at, is there adequate security? Do customers feel welcome and safe? Are there facilities within the bank which obviously can be used by staff and customers? And then last but not the least, is the building in an accessible area and in an area which allows easy access from customers' point of view during operational hours, from staff point of view during operational hours. And that is what you would be looking at considering when you look at physical resources. So when a high street bank opens up a branch, or a bank opens up a branch on a high street, let's put it this way, they would be considering all these factors, things like parking, accessibility, cleanliness in terms of the building, accessibility to the building. Does it have accessibility to people with disability? Like, for example, wheelchair access. If you're not on the ground floor and on the first floor, then does it have access to lifts? Those are the things that you would need to look at considering before even the bank decides that, we'll be looking at, taking up this space or, obviously looking at going into this physical space to, open branch operations in a particular area. And then because these are being done to provide services to customers, you would also obviously look into the detail, assuming if you were looking at setting up something, you would look at space planning, you would look at obviously transportation links, you would look at what kind of services could be provided. Is it just a branch which will allow certain types of operations to happen, or is it a branch which will handle all operations? For example, international transfers, opening up bank accounts, looking at taking in deposits, and in some cases, allowing exchange of foreign currency. Those are services that you would be looking at in terms of managing even before you look at setting up that branch in that location. And obviously you would need, so if you put on the thinking hat, you would essentially need physical resources. That could be equipment, machinery. So you need computers, desks, maybe a waiting area which will have furniture. So those are the things I would say. And if I start thinking creatively, mostly if you go to the bank, generally you would see there are lots of toys, wheelchair access, push car access available, so that if parents are bringing kids in, and there are waiting areas which are basically nicely designed. So, and then at some stages you would have, basic things like a water dispenser, a toilet facility. Those kind of things would be available in a particular branch or a location, and that would become much more suitable to be able to offer services even before the bank decides to, open a branch in that location. So when we talk about how do we evaluate the use of physical resources and how do we manage them and monitor them, you need to look at taking up an example. Now, an example which I gave earlier, but I'll stick to that, which is, for example, during COVID vaccinations, there were requirements of different centers to be created, which would have been easily accessible by members of public, and that would be local so that people don't have to travel far distances to be able to get vaccinated. And there were areas obviously ensured that after you take the vaccination, you had to wait for about half an hour or so before you went ahead and drove away, or if you were driving, then in those cases you were asked to wait half an hour. So waiting area was an important consideration. So when we look at this particular exercise and this particular large rollout, which happened in the UK and in several other countries, you would generally see that the shortlisting of these locations and centers where COVID vaccination was offered was done predominantly with a certain requirement in mind. Things like a waiting area, ample facility for parking, social distancing, which was an important aspect at that point in time. So the waiting areas had to be huge enough in the sense that there could be social distancing when people were sitting. There could be multiple stations, and obviously the center was, open. When I say open, that means the facilities were chosen which were, airy in the sense that they allowed flow of air, or had natural, let's say, ventilation available which meant that if people are coming in to receive vaccination, they would not, obviously be entering an environment which would primarily be contaminated or could lead to more infections or transmission of infections. So in those cases, there was a key consideration in terms of what and where would these centers be open. That means physical location was important. And then after the location was shortlisted, we went into further detailing of what parameters would be required to shortlist that location. Does it meet parameters like open spaces, good ventilation, ample area for parking, or ample area in terms of a seating area? And then these were bits which were important from a point of view of shortlisting that. And then that location was used as a temporary, COVID vaccination center. And this is what you would need to be required to cover when we look at task 2.1. Another example that I would give you would be if we consider, for example, a haulage company. Just as an example, a haulage company which basically has lots of trucks. They transport goods and materials from one location to the other. And obviously, when we look at managing and monitoring some of these physical resources, what is the physical resource for a haulage company? They would look at 2 or 3 main physical resources. Obviously, there are lots of them, but just to look at from a point of view of a haulage company, a company which does distribution, warehousing, and transportation, you would essentially have trucks and warehouse or distribution centers from which material would move from one location or one warehouse to the other. So when we look at monitoring and managing of these physical resources, it is crucial for the organization to ensure that the equipment, which is in this case the vehicles, are regularly serviced. They are running and operational, because that is what is used to actually transport goods from one warehouse to the other. So when we look at the evaluation of these physical resources, which is the key component of storage, which is a warehouse, and the monitoring and movement of the goods from one warehouse to the other done through trucks or haulage, let's say large trucks or vehicles, essentially would be required to be monitored and obviously managed. So vehicles would have to be regularly serviced to ensure that they are able to, carry this, products across. And then there would be requirement of maybe software or tracking. For example, most big haulage companies or most companies today have vehicle trackers, or they have trackers on the vehicles, so understanding where the location of the goods is at any given point in time. There is an inventory management system in place. Obviously, this was true for COVID vaccine as well. When you went into the center, you had to show some sort of a photo ID, and that would confirm that this is your address and this is where you're staying, and that is where the vaccination, was allocated, and obviously dosage or shots were made available because you are living in a particular area. You couldn't go from one area to the other and obviously get vaccinated. You could technically, but it was not preferred. And when we look at this as an option, we look at management of inventory. So that means the vaccine was stored, the Pfizer Moderna vaccine was required to be stored under minus 40-degree temperature and had 2 hours to be able to use when it is brought out for the purposes of being given to an individual. So when we look at management, in that case, it involved inventory management so that the optimal number of vaccines were brought out. Similarly, when we look at moving stuff through haulage companies, assuming if you're moving grocery or fresh fruits, they have to be moved into an air-conditioned, warehouse from one facility to the other so that they don't rot away or, don't get spoiled. And in those cases, inventory management has to be done, and that is done using a software. So whether we look at an example of a bank, we look at an example of a COVID vaccination center or a haulage company, you would still need, these resources, which are saying, is the storage of vaccines in at minus 40 degrees centigrade temperature. You look at bank in terms of premises, in terms of, storing of cash, maybe a safe required. And when we look at a haulage company in terms of warehousing, air conditioning facilities and vehicles and trucks with trackers fitted to be able to understand where they are in terms of their journey from one warehouse to the other. And this all requires what is called close monitoring and management. Close monitoring and management in terms of managing inventory, managing the schedules in terms of which truck will go from one warehouse to the other at what day, what time. You're looking at tracking of some of these movement of products, or say, for example, vaccines, or grocery products being moved from one warehouse to the other. And that would also involve things like physical audits. You would look at maybe planning from a point of view of ensuring that there is enough manpower and people trained enough to be able to deliver the vaccination. In some cases, when I look at the bank, enough people like tellers and people who are able to offer these services to customers when they come in. And in a haulage company's case, you're looking at people or truck drivers, or maybe people who are able to do warehousing and manage and move the material or inventory, load them, unload them. And these are things which are required to be managed when you're looking at monitoring and managing, physical resources. So this bit would need to be, covered primarily by taking an example, and that would help you, complete the assessment criteria 2.1, which is how do we look at evaluating the use of physical resources to manage and monitor in a particular, by giving a particular example. Is that okay? Any questions on assessment criteria 2.1?
No, sir.
Now, when we look at, assessment criteria 2.2, it again talks about evaluate as a command verb. And here it says evaluate the measures which are required to reduce wastage or resource wastage, essentially. So when we look at, let's look at a practical situation in terms of, where do we see wastage happening? What is the concept of waste? So if I look at a manufacturing process, say, for example, a very basic example that I would say, for example, in the house, you have a log burner. Now, during winters, some of us have log burners in the house. And obviously what you do is, in order to keep your house warm, you would obviously burn the logs in the log burner. Now, once you look at using the log burner and you put some wood in and you burn it, obviously in the fireplace or in the log burner, what tends to happen is it leaves a bit of a residue after the wood is burnt out. And that leaves what is called the ash or soot, essentially, and that is what you need to replace or change, or, obviously brush away, whichever way you put it. And that is basically a waste which is produced as a byproduct of you burning logs in a fireplace or a log burner. So what we want to be able to do and understand in this particular assessment criteria is how do we look at ways to reduce wastage, or look at coming up with ways through which wastage can be reduced when you're using physical resources. Now, you might have a bundle of logs at your home, but if it's extremely cold, you keep the log burner and the fireplace going. You might end up using 7, 8, 9, 10 logs if you have that as stock. And once that inventory runs out, what happens is you have to go back into the market and buy more logs. So here, in order to reduce the wastage, that means where, in order to not frequently clean your log burner and your fireplace, what we sometimes do is we get wood which is kiln dried wood, or wood which is essentially, already pre-treated, and it leaves very little or no residue in terms of ash or soot. Sometimes people burn coal in the fireplace as well, but what tends to happen is there are different types of coal available. There is a coal which is primarily, which will leave residue or, leave some bit of waste at the end of it when it gets burnt out. But there is coal available which is smoke-free, and there is coal available which is smoke-free and residue-free. That means when it burns out, it obviously leaves no residue or waste at the end of it. Now, you can get these 3 different types in terms of quality. But what is the difference? Their difference is in terms of price. You get normal coal, you might get, say, for 10 pounds a bag, of coal. But when you look at smoke-free and residue-free coal, you might need to pay 35 pounds for a bag of coal, because that product leaves no waste when it burns out. Then these are things that we need to be able to look at carefully to understand what is waste, why is waste required to be minimized, in terms of, when we look at carrying out activities. So the activity that I was mentioning in this case, if I relate it to the same example, The activity is you're burning a log because you want the house to remain warm. But what that activity is essentially producing at the end of it is that at some stage when the fire runs out, what tends to happen is it leaves a residue which needs to be cleaned. And that is what produces waste. Now, if I look at taking an example of a production or an engineering or a manufacturing company, what tends to happen is they are, say, for example, we look at Nissan cars. The car factory is producing cars. But at some stage, there is a waste also being produced as a byproduct of the production of finished products of cars. So when we look at the Nissan factory in Sunderland, which produces Qashqai, there are lots of different inputs which they get from suppliers, contractors, and other manufacturers. So engine, chassis, car components, leathers, interiors, tires. Most of these things come into the factory wherein they are created into a finished product, Nissan Qashqai, and that is what normally rolls out from the factory floor. Now, when you drive the car, or obviously when they test the car, one of the byproducts which comes out after creating the product is the used tires. For example, they have to be disposed away. So that is a wastage at some stage which the usage of the car as a function of the product is concerned produces. So when I burn logs or coal, it produces a waste. When I look at a car manufacturing facility, they test these cars. They have lots of processes which are being done to create the finished product, and some part of these processes which are inputs on products, which are basically like you get the chassis, welding has to be done, it creates a byproduct. Painting has to be done, it creates a bit of a byproduct or waste essentially, and they get accumulated over a point in time. And they are basically considered as what is the output being produced. But along with that output, some waste is also being produced, which needs to be recycled, or it needs to be, let's say, reduced in terms of wastage. Now, if we see that sometimes when we look at the concept of, if I put it this way, that when we look at the concept of, wastage, from a business or from an organization point of view, it can have significant impacts on a business or the operations of a business. And in this case, when we look at waste, even on our environment. Now, one of the things that we have seen and read about quite a lot is the plastic in oceans, right? So we use bottled water. There are 16 billion bottles of bottled water which is used, and 268 billion, if I remember the statistics correctly, every year. So there are this amount produced every month, and then about that amount, 268 billion, which are produced across in the year globally. Now, most of this is not recycled. And what we are seeing over the last 10, 15, 20 years is that a lot of plastic is finally ending up into oceans. And this is leading to the accumulation of waste, which is affecting the environment. Now, if I look at anything that has a process wherein it is using natural material, then it is processed into a product, and then as a product that it gets sold. But when it is being processed into a finished product or a service, it creates some sort of a waste. Now, if I have to classify these as waste, what I mean by that is that it could create what is called financial impact. That means if there is a lot of wastage happening in the production of bottled water, then companies would see that their profitability is going down, because every time they are looking at using or producing single-use plastic, which when is used is done away with, and they have to produce it again. One of the things why you see that, if we go back, just to share with you, if you go back 2 or 3 decades, you normally see everything was available as, in glass bottles. Even when we used to get milk delivered to our home, and we used to buy milk bottles from the grocery store or go to, places, bottled milk was always in what is called glass bottles. Over the years, what we have seen is that as the consumption increased, the circulation, distribution of some of these products increased. The transportation bottleneck was that when these products were being transferred in glass, it used to lead to shattering and obviously a lot of wastage of product in terms of milk in this case. Because when you go over humps, bumps, then, and obviously if there is a knock or a shock which happens when it is being transported in trucks or in, trains or other such, vehicles, you would see that this could lead to breakage of bottles, and that would lead to a lot of waste. At some stage over the years, what started to happen was that this started to move to plastics. We see Coca-Cola, and I think everybody has had Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola was always bottled Coca-Cola, in the sense glass bottles. We still have them available in our supermarkets, but they are, they bring them back as what are called celebration or anniversary offers. But generally, Coca-Cola and the bottling of Coca-Cola was always in glass, but now they've become, single-use plastic bottles because it is easy, to transport. It is lighter, it is cheaper to manufacture, and obviously leads to no loss even during transportation if, the movement of these goods are, prone to, say, for example, shattering or, for example, any sort of due stress which is applied. So plastic is generally considered much more, robust than glass bottles. So this leads to less wastage. But what has happened over the years is that usage of this has led to creation of a lot of waste. And in some countries, governments have implemented a policy wherein they look at 10p being charged at the time when you buy something like a bottled water or, a bottled drink. And there are machines which are installed in places like Sweden, Finland, Norway, Germany, wherein if you return the bottle, you get 10p back. Now, this is something which is being considered in the UK as well. And the reason why this is being done is because this is the consumption and the manufacturing is so high in volume globally that we need to be able to control this waste which is being created at the end of the day by the circulation of this product. And this has a financial impact. The reason why it has not been passed in the UK in the fact is that the government is not able to get a consensus with the industry to say that 10p should be the reasonable charge, which should be charged in terms when products are being sold, as bottled beverage or a soft drink or any sort of bottled water. Now, what the companies are expected to do is absorb this, because you pay normally when you buy Coke a pound, or you buy a Tango, you normally pay a pound. But essentially what is happening in this case is there's a financial impact. Who foots that bill of 10p? Now, government is pushing the manufacturers to look at it, that you should absorb that 10p and, provide that along with it. Otherwise, if you say £1 and 10 penny, they say that it will affect our sales. And obviously, because customers will not buy some of or shun the buying of their products. So what the context in this case is, in order to reduce wastage, which has a financial impact, because there's a loss if they start selling the product at 90p instead of a pound, because 10p is to be returned back to the customer. This could be a direct cost, and which is actually, a cost that most companies are not willing to pay or bear the bill. And that is because it is going to have a financial impact on their balance sheet. Now, when we look at operational efficiency, this is so we can quantify waste in different forms, because we have different types of different types of resources. The example that I've given you of a bottled water and the return of plastic back with the 10p coming back to the customer is basically looking at an example of financial wastage. Now, if I look at operational efficiency in a car manufacturing plant, they want to reduce waste which is being produced by, let's say, the usage of material to produce a finished good. Then in this case, if the machine is not properly installed or maintained or breaks down frequently, then it leads to creation of waste because it disrupts the production floor or the process. And that delays orders, and delaying of orders leads to negative customer satisfaction. In some cases, you would generally see that cancellation would also happen, and it would have a knock-on effect in terms of the delivery was supposed to be done, but the delivery vehicle has arrived and it's still waiting for it to be collected. And in those cases, you would generally see operational efficiency is required. And if that is not the case in companies or in facilities which are producing goods through manufacturing, then you would normally see operational efficiency, contributing towards wastage of time and effort, and it finally leads to cost. You could also have bottled water that I've given you an example, which is basically environmental impact. So a lot of plastic ending up into our oceans, and that is meaning that it is leading to environmental pollution. And this, at over a point in time, is going to be looking at also if there is, for example, excessive use of any sort of natural resource, like cutting down of trees. In the Amazon is being asked to be reduced or completely stopped, because Amazon is considered to be the lungs of, the earth. And if the trees disappear, then the production of oxygen and the absorption of carbon dioxide, which happens by the Amazon, would essentially mean that the air quality, would go down drastically in terms of the quality of the air we breathe. And in this case, it is having an environmental impact. So the El Nino effect that we talk about is an example of, maybe depletion of forests, cutting of trees, and that is environmental wastage and having an environmental impact. So what we want to be looking at in this particular task is talking about an example, which by talking through an example, we would need to be able to show very clearly and talk about and give arguments to say why there is a reason for us to reduce waste. Now, reduction of waste can also lead to, let's put it this way, a lot of organizations, including the NHS, and for example, some of the main big organizations, global, which have functions across or, operations across all countries. They have global operations, essentially. They have signed up to what is called a pledge. And that pledge falls under what is called the corporate social responsibility. So in their case, this is related to reputation of the business or the reputation of the organization. Here, what they are looking at is looking at measuring the social impact of what kind of waste is being created. And in order to reduce this waste, what they are looking at is what are the social implications primarily for the business, for the organization. And in those cases, when they see that this is related to reputation, or this is basically bringing a bad name to the business or the organization is investing into facilities which will help reduce and manage the waste it produces. For example, I gave and I shared yesterday that the European Union had made a ruling that by 2027, all supermarkets will need to be self-sufficient in terms of energy usage. So in order to reduce waste and become self-sufficient, a lot of these supermarkets are investing into what are called, let's say, smaller versions of producing their own energy. And this is being done or will be done through recycling of waste, which basically is produced from the supermarket. And that would mean that, one, they meet the corporate social responsibility. Second, they meet the legislative and the requirements set by the governments. And the third is they are also looking at, protecting, let's put it this way. When I say protecting, they are building reputation to show that as a business, they are conscious about waste and the resources they use to, service customers and the waste it produces. And in order to ensure that their reputation does not suffer, they are investing into sustainability methods of producing these goods and services, which are environmentally, friendly or will not damage the environment. And in those cases, you are looking at managing the resources to produce less and less waste as possible. And if it does, now obviously you can't make it zero in certain cases, but it can be minimized wherein it does not have a financial impact or an impact on the operational efficiency or an environmental impact, in some cases, social impact. And that would be something that you would need to cover by looking at talking about how businesses or organizations should look at reducing waste. One example, which I'll give you here, from a point of view of NHS in particular, there are lots of different types of waste which gets produced in the NHS. Now, if you put on your thinking hat and you think that you work within a hospital, what kind of waste does the hospital produce? Any ideas, any guesses in terms of what kind of waste does the hospital produce? So if I look at putting on the thinking hat and if I say the waste that the hospital produces, it could be stained linen, bed or clothing. It could be syringes. It could be used equipment, which is basically, being used once. You look at the aprons, the gloves, and then the plastic, the personal protective equipment, PPE as we call it, and this kind of waste which the hospitals produce has to be then recycled. Yes, absolutely correct, Maria. Needles, gloves, aprons, clothes. These are the kind of things which the hospital would need to recycle. Now, in some cases, recycling is not possible because if the cloth is stained and it cannot be, it might be, having infections, then obviously it has to be done away with. When I say done away, it means it has to be recycled or basically incinerated in order to ensure that there is no spread of infection. So when we look at waste being produced from hospitals, there are loads of different types of waste. One could be food waste. One could be physical waste, which is coming out as paper and other bits that we normally see. But then there is medical waste. There is specialized waste which needs to be disposed of, specifically after, say, for example, blood tests or any sort of tests which are done. Those wastes are to be chemically and, neutralized and obviously then done away with. And in those cases, most hospitals would have their own recycling facility or some sort of a facility where an agency collects this and then basically, recycles it to ensure that there are no environmental damages or no repercussions of this particular waste leading into an open environment and then causing damage to and leading to spread of infections or otherwise. So when we look at this as an example, you would be able to take this as an example and talk about it, and that would help you cover this particular task. Now, when we look at one particular context of waste management, we talk about linear economy versus circular economy. Now, this is a theoretical concept that you need to understand, that what is linear economy and what is, circular economy. So when we talk about linear economy and circular economy, what we are essentially talking about here is a linear economy and circular economy are basically two economic models, and they are basically used and applied, in different contexts where resources are either used in production or whether resources are used for consumption. Now, when I look at linear economy and the model, this model takes into account that we need to be able to take certain material, make it as that material needs to be working, is taken as an input, and that input then once processed leads to some sort of an output, which is the final product. But once the final product is produced, it also then produces certain amount of waste material. And this is normally, when I say take, make, and waste, which is given in the concept of linear economy, the take is basically the natural resource. That means we are taking out, how do you make iron? For example, if you're manufacturing cars, iron essentially comes from the earth. So it is a natural resource. When we say make, making is happening within a factory. That is where the iron is being mined from the earth, being produced into sheets or metals or steel. And then at a later stage, it is being then used by further manufacturing facilities to produce that into a car, for example. But at the end of it, the production of this particular material also leads to creation of what is called waste. And this waste, when it is to be disposed of in the environment, needs to be treated before it is to be, say, for example, if water is being used in nuclear plants to cool the reactors down, then water is to be treated through towers, and then it has to be brought to, normal temperature and then released into the rivers. Otherwise, it can lead to harming the fishes and the flora and fauna within our rivers. So when we look at a system wherein value is being created, that means some sort of a valuable product is being created and that is being used to sell other products or services to customers, then in this case, the waste being produced also needs to be managed in the sense that this managed waste should not cause any detrimental effect to the environment. And an example, best example in this case I would give you is that when a company looks at, mining metals to manufacture, for example, the Coke cans that we use, at some stage, what you are going to see is that the mining produces tin. Tin is then obviously raw form of tin is processed into a factory, and that is then in a form which is made available to Coke or Pepsi or any other brand, and they basically then create what is called the beverage can. Now, once the soda or whatever way you call it, the drink is finished or is consumed, the cans are thrown away. Now, this throwing away of the can represents linear economy, because in this case, cans are not being reused or recycled in any way. And what it is doing is basically producing a waste. Now, this concept has changed over the years, wherein some of these are now being replaced by what is a new concept called circular economy. Now, here the idea is whatever you make, whatever you use, at some stage, what we want to be able to do is reuse that and put it back into circulation. So cans now, and bottled water is an example that I gave you in some countries, is now, cans can be, obviously, when we look at collection of bins in the UK, there are 4 different bins. You have, cans and bottles and plastic, bottles being collected separately. So it goes into a recycling facility like Veolia or some of the companies which run this. And what they do is they reclaim plastics, useful metals from the waste, and the balance left out waste is incinerated or, done away with into landfills. And that is where it produces manure and, agricultural products, fertilizer, things like that. But the main part of the waste, which is material like glass, cans, whatever is reusable, is actually taken out, and it's being put to reuse by looking at waste management. And this concept is generally what is now popular and is being implemented across economies, across countries globally, is what is called circular economy. That means resources are finite. We cannot just make the resource, and then after which it has been, the value has been used, you throw away. But because resources are finite and, things are not indefinitely available, what we have to do is start to recycle them and return the useful materials back into recirculation. And then the material which cannot be reused has to be treated and then done away or disposed of in the environment. So this is a theoretical concept you need to be aware of, that 30, 40 years back it was linear economy, but today the concept is circular economy, which means we make, we consume, and we reuse or recycle whatever is possible before the life of the product or the service is being once it has been used for the life or cycle of the service that the product actually provides. Is that okay? So the collection of, say, for example, needles that you mentioned, Maria, in hospitals, or the collection of certain type of products which are then selectively collected and disposed of to a supplier, is because these needles and syringes are then melted down, and then obviously the metal reclaimed from it and then put back into manufacturing to create newer products which can then be reused and obviously as brand new products, because that involves what is called recycling. Now, let's briefly look at the third and the fourth assessment criteria. The third criteria talks about assessing the cost of what is called high-profile technological failures. Now, because technology has become so important part of our life, assuming we are using Zoom right now, if the Zoom software is to malfunction, or if the internet connectivity is to drop for a couple of seconds, what will happen is the session would get disrupted. So here, the cost of this particular snag, even for a few seconds, would mean that our session would get disconnected. So this is a cost in terms of, we might have to look at restarting the session, restart the recording, start from scratch, ask you where we left, what you were able to hear, and then we'll have to spend that time and effort again to go through this content. So similarly, when you look at, places where obviously technology is being used to deliver product, goods, and services to consumers, if the technology fails, then what will happen is there will be a repercussion in the sense that you would generally see that services would be affected. A simple case in point that I would give you is, for example, when you look at the operation theater or OTs within hospitals, they're always running on a backup generator power. Is because when the operation is happening or when a critical operation is being done, the surgeons or the doctors which are operating on a patient, if the light switches off, can lead to fatal accidents. That means the patient could lose his life, because even for a fraction of a second, if the light switches off and if they're operating on the patient, that could be fatal. losing electricity in certain machinery like life support machine or whatever is being used during that operation is going to be highly critical, because even a few seconds of lights, electricity being switched off or not being available would mean that it could be fatal to the patient. So here, when we talk about technology in this case is power which is coming from either a hydroelectric power station or a nuclear power station or a thermal power station, coal power station, basically is being transported to the grid. And if there is a loss of power happens for a couple of minutes or seconds, forget minutes, for a couple of seconds, it could be fatal to a patient's life. So here, when we talk about technological failures, these failures happen because the machinery or the equipment has not been maintained or, annually done maintenance in terms of maintaining it for keeping it running. So annual maintenance of machinery, equipment is a must in most organizations, wherein it is being used for either critical purposes or it is being used for, in the case of operation theater as an example, for life-saving, purposes. So if the machinery, if the backup power is not there, or if, for example, certain machinery malfunctions, it can be fatal. So in these cases, what we look at is when such failures do happen, we generally see that it piles up financial cost, or it leads to, what is called a loss. It could be life loss, it could be financial loss, it could be a loss in terms of a customer loss, but the costs are quite high. So here again, in this example, what we need to do is when it says assess, what we need to be able to do is talk about the advantages and disadvantages of what happens by taking an example of what a high value or, say, for example, a high profile technological failure would look like. And that would mean if, for example, a bank's system, which I've used as an example throughout the presentation, if a bank's online system is hacked and username and passwords are stolen, then the bank would have an irreparable loss, because one, the customers would lose faith on the bank's ability to be able to keep their data safe, which would mean loss of reputation, loss of trust. It could also mean legal costs, because if the customers' accounts are hacked, or if they lose or the money gets stolen through electronic means from the bank, then you would generally see that this will pile up legal cost on the banks as well. And what you're also saying is irreparable reputation damage, which is caused because some of these things or vulnerabilities into the banking software or the systems were not spotted by the team themselves. So here, the cost of such technological failure could also even lead to fines. During the financial crisis, if you look at, a lot of banks were also fined because they had gone into practices which meant that some of these were not allowed under a regulation in different countries. And a lot of banks, like in the UK, RBS Bank, Barclays Bank, NatWest in particular, these were banks which were fined millions of pounds simply because they weren't able to, allow some of these measures to be put into place, which meant that these, failures could have been prevented. And when we look at the use of technology, by taking an example of what I've given, like the use of technology in terms of the operation theater, the backup electric power, or in the case of banks that I've just shared, that they would employ normally cybersecurity analysts or basically, softwares like antiviruses or firewalls, which would prevent hackers from hacking the system, is all being done to ensure that such failures or vulnerabilities are not exposed, and this then protects consumer data and obviously the important financial information, which would mean that if a failure is to happen, they have contingency plans in place, and that would mean that they can bring certain things pretty much back online very quickly without the customers suffering, or consumers in this case, suffering any loss of any service. Another example that you can think of when you put on your thinking hats is you generally see that sometimes if websites are down, a lot of big companies have their websites hosted on different servers. If one site is down, or is one site in terms of server side of things is down, the website still loads up they're able to still service the customers because they have installations on multiple remote sites, and that allows backup to come back and bring kick in if the one site goes down. Then backup allows these other sites to be able to service data, and that is because they have procedures, and they have installed backup servers which allow things to be brought online very quickly, and thereby it reduces any sort of technological loss of either financial loss or customer loss or reputational loss to occur when we look at businesses. You look at one other example that I've faced myself, and I'll give you, is when Apple brings out an update. What they do is they, just as an example on technological failure, if you look at a couple of years back when Apple used to bring out the new updates on their phones, you could try updating your phone because there were billions of customers updating it at the same time. Sometimes your server timed out and it says the update failed. Now that led to a bit of a reputational loss for Apple. So what they now do is when they bring it out, they basically ensure that there is load balancing which is done, and they have enough servers and enough locations across the globe which are basically able to serve these updates through their servers. That means even millions of customers, billions of customers which are connected to Apple servers are still able to download the update, and there is no relatively slowness or any sort of queuing up on that technologically, because they are employing and using ways to ensure that this kind of a failure does not happen. Now, this is an example that you would need to look into and take into account and talk about things like what is the cost of high profile technological failures. Cost of these failures could basically be looking at points like reputational loss of trust. It could be legal costs in some cases, and last but not the least, losses. For example, if you're trying to download something and if it is not working, you might say, okay, it's best that I switch to a different brand and buy something different, because if it's not working now, what is the guarantee that it'll work in the future? So it could lead to accumulating or increasing financial losses because you're losing your customer base, and this could be something that you could highlight in this particular task. Is that okay? Any questions on this? So let's look at the last assessment criteria, which is also talking about assessing, using a business case, the use of ethical and sustainable resources. So here what we are looking at is primarily talking about a business case wherein we need to look at choosing a business, discussing its profile and image, talking about how the business looks at using ethical ways to conduct business, and then how do these ethical ways and means essentially allow the business to offer products and services which are sustainable, or at least look sustainable from an environmental perspective. Now, an example that I've taken here is the Marks and Spencer Plan A. The reason I've taken this particular organization is that Marks and Spencer in the early years in 2014, under the leadership of Sir Stuart Rose, who was then the chairman of Marks and Spencer, decided that they're going to reduce any sort of waste that it produces as a byproduct of conducting its business activities. Now here, because the Marks and Spencer is known as a clothes retailer, so obviously it is known as a brand globally because it produces exceptionally good quality of clothes, and there is a lot of waste which gets produced when clothes are being produced within Marks and Spencer. It leads to wastage in terms of water, it leads to wastage in terms of the cotton that they use, and obviously it also produces clothes which uses around 8,000 different chemicals, and that would mean that these chemicals or byproducts after the cloth has been produced leads to the chemicals which are produced, and they cannot be released into our rivers because they can damage the ecosystem in the river and the flora and fauna. So they decided that all dyeing and washing of the clothes, which basically is required to be done, and when they do this, they discard some of the output which gets produced as wastage without treating, was they on an average decided that this is something that they will need to minimize going forward, because it is not just hurting the reputation but also hurting the environment in the long run. So they took an example that when you look at washing and dyeing before, say, for example, your jeans are produced or zines are produced, it uses about 32 kg of, water on detergent annually. So what they have started to do is implement something in their manufacturing of clothes, which basically requires less detergent and, the production, not going into technical reasons, but they've started to produce cotton or clothes which are made out of cotton, which are less creased, which require less ironing, and obviously can be, used for longer, purposes or duration in terms of its purpose. And this allows the business to propagate the idea of sustainability, that we are using resources ethically, environmental resources ethically. We are environmentally conscious of the fact that as a company, we produce clothes, and this creates a lot of wastage, but we are trying to reduce this waste by producing clothes now, or producing clothes and linen now, which is going to be longer life and would require less treatment in order to produce it from scratch. And this would allow the business to use ethical practices and also make the products that it produces much more sustainable. That means they will have a longer shelf life, and you would not need to replace some of these clothes, from that point of view. Now, they did this because there was government legislation, there were pressures from the UN, and, obviously in other environmentalist, firms and Greenpeace and some of the other firms, exposing, or let's say, bringing across information about companies which are producing clothes to say that this is the waste they produce, and they do not, take care of that waste. And there are no ethics, or obviously morality needs to be questioned in terms of how these companies are allowed to make so much profits when they are producing these products, goods and services. But at the end of the day, they are harming the environment by releasing the byproduct or the waste product of the manufacturing process being released into oceans on our rivers, and that is damaging our flora and fauna for the long run. Now, when we look at all this, this is where what we need to be looking at, using a business case to say that why M&S put a plan A into place, and by 2025 they will look at reducing any sort of product that they produce, service that they offer. They're going to reduce their waste to zero. Any byproduct or anything in terms of an output of that product, when it is produced, their waste is going to be, they are working on reducing that to zero. So as a business case, what we need to be looking at is picking up an organization, or in this case, picking up an example, which will be of an organization or business, and then look at a particular product or service and see how this business is looking at improving when I say first, looking at offering services, which is going to be looking at using ethical ways to produce the goods, and then looking at reducing the waste which it produces from these goods by manufacturing or the production of these goods, which will not harm the environment. So there are several examples that you can actually take. And when we look at several examples in this case, what we would want to look at is the examples that we have discussed. Primarily, say, for example, bottled water. We look at, say, for example, Coca-Cola cans, for example. I'm just saying, canned beverages. They would be examples of, by using a company or a name here to talk about and look at this particular assessment criteria, by talking about that particular brand, product they produce, and how they have over the years looked at reducing the waste being produced because of the manufacturing of that material. And this is primarily falling through on ethical and ethical reasons, and obviously looking at sustainability from a long-term perspective. And that is what you would need to do in order to obviously complete this particular assessment criteria of the task. And when you do so, you could look at making points, taking up points which essentially would act as arguments, and they would be the consumer demand, for example, might not be slowing. So when we look at, under the current Tory government, the announcement of 40 new hospitals will be built. And I know that, when we look at building enough new hospitals, this is to look at meeting the increased demand, of services which are required, because obviously there are new developments, residential developments coming up, cities are expanding, population is expanding, and obviously because of this, it puts a pressure on, these services being provided under the NHS or by the hospitals in a particular area. So there are expansions being done to current hospitals, which will primarily be looking at taking into account that it will reduce patient wait times, it will reduce, the waiting list, or reduce the waiting list over a point in time for people who are, essentially waiting to, say, for example, receive hip replacement or knee replacement, or, operations which are being put off because of COVID, as an example. And in those cases, what they're looking at is now, because of the increased demand for some specific type of services, the hospitals need to be expanded, or services need to be expanded. And in order to look at regulatory compliance, because sometimes, when we talk about ethical, reasons, and when we talk about sustainability, it is also because sometimes governments and, various key bodies are also introducing new legislation to ensure that, companies and organizations are complying with the law in terms of protecting the environment, looking at renewable resources, or looking at reducing waste. And in those cases, compliance comes into play, because regulations related to sustainability and ethical sourcing are becoming more stringent. And when we look at an example of Primark, just mentioning this here, I don't know if you recall, but a lot of us probably saw this in the news, that when we look at Primark clothes being sold in the UK, they seem to be the lowest price. But when some investigations were done, they found out that these clothes are being manufactured in factories in Bangladesh, Vietnam, in Pakistan, and other places, wherein the supplier, or in this case, the contractor of Primark, is not even paying a living human wage to the people who are working within those factories. The conditions are quite squally. They are not health and safety-wise safe, the premises, and the conditions under which these workers work to produce goods, which Primark then sells on high street, is not acceptable. And there were a few accidents and fires and other bits which have happened, which have led to a loss of life. And that led to an industry-wide initiative wherein a lot of these companies then said that they will invest and own up these facilities, which are being run by contractors, to ensure at the end of the day that there is a bit of a moral and an ethic being applied, and people are being paid fairly. And last but not the least, the conditions under which the goods are being manufactured, are to be improved to a particular standard which is acceptable under the law and legislation within that country. And then looking at, sustainability from a point of view of ensuring that once they have met the regulatory compliance, the sustainability side of things is to look at using, resources that involve use of less water, lower energy consumption, and more efficient machinery, which can be, provided to their contractors to be able to reduce, costs, financial costs, and financial, cost and burden on the people which are working within these factories. So if you have updated equipment, and if, for example, you have a latest, equipment, then sometimes you would see the productivity would increase. A case in point is, if you have a PC and it is quite slow and it is an outdated processor, you might have the same task that you are trying to do, might take maybe half an hour, 45 minutes to do. But if you have a faster PC and you're trying to type a letter because it has more RAM, more hard drive in a faster processor, then this bit of activity can be, speeded or sped, basically can be done speedily because of the efficiency which it provides by using, a better configuration of the PC. So here, operational efficiency, is related to sustainability, and that is where these companies were asked to provide, updated machinery and processes which would allow contractors to implement them within their factories, thereby introducing, or bringing operational efficiency when people are working within those factories. And that is an example, or with some of these arguments, you can use this as an example primarily to cover this particular task. Is that okay? So I have taken several examples and I've shared several examples with you, but the idea here would be to try and look at, one particular organization that you are aware of and can follow through, and then basically mention it and cover it across, for the purposes of, looking at taking as an example to build arguments, present advantages and disadvantages, and then towards the end do a conclusion to say why, because some of these tasks in the assessment criteria, learning outcome 2 assessment criteria, are basically using higher order command verbs like assess and evaluate. And that is where you would need to use an example, show the application, and then, using the example, essentially detail it out to meet that criteria. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Okay, good stuff. Now, in business side of things, Sumit, specifically for you, there are certain parts of the tasks which you will see in the presentation, which are given out as merit and distinction as well. So they are, again, basically expansion to the basic tasks, but you would need to take an example of an organization here to be able to cover them off, because the task is not asking you to descriptively or theoretically cover it, but it is asking for you to show its application by taking up an example. And that is where in the previous presentation and in today's presentation, I've mentioned those tasks separately towards the end, so that you are aware of that on your side in business, they would require you to attempt the higher order tasks as well in case you're looking at achieving a better grade. But on healthcare side, the unit is not graded, so obviously you would not need to attempt, or go into the merit or distinction criteria. So that brings us to the end of discussion of Learning Outcome 2 today, which I hope you understood, and the presentation and some of the examples that I've shared have been useful, and this helps you constructively and conclusively understand the importance of using physical resources effectively within an organization or within any organization. So with this, we'll come to the end of today's session, and I'm going to primarily look at closing the session, and a copy of this recording would be available just shortly after this, and we'll catch up next week to cover and discuss Learning Outcome 3s and 4 going forward. Thanks so much for attending.